Vamos!
Good morning and welcome to TAO's next session of our Member Resiliency series with Professor Laura Burney-Nissen from Portland State University. I'm Skip Newberry, President and CEO of TAO. A couple of rules of engagement that we're going to cover before we get started. All participants have been muted, so please remain on mute unless a TAO staff member calls on you and asks you to talk. You may ask or respond to questions in the chat box publicly or privately by directing your message to Justin Martinez or Kara Snow. We'll monitor the chat box throughout the discussion. We ask you all to engage via the participant icon on your screen. And please engage with us on social media if you take any screenshots of myself or Professor Nissen during the call and share those. We'll definitely reshare them as well through our network. And we also want to encourage everyone that due to the limited time we have, we'll capture all questions in the chat and shift any unanswered questions to our online member engagement platform, which is called Mobilize. And that's where you'll see responses to those questions within a week or so. If you have any questions about joining Mobilize, please reach out to Justin, whose email is on the screen. If you have any questions about joining TAO, please reach out to membership@techoregon.org. TAO staff support today is provided by Kara Snow and Justin. They're happy to take feedback, questions, comments, or talk to you about sponsorship opportunities. A huge thank you to AT&T and Portland State University for underwriting this series. We appreciate their sponsorship and support. My pleasure now to introduce Dr. Laura Nissen. Dr. Nissen has a PhD in social work from the University of Denver and has been a professor at PSU for 20 years. In addition to her futurism work, Dr. Nissen's research includes equity, ethics, and technology, as well as innovation in social work practice. So Laura, thank you for joining us. I know you're gonna kick things off with a little bit of a presentation and overview, and then we'll get into some Q&A.
Terrific. Hi, everybody. Good morning. I'm gonna go through the sharing of the slides process here. So it's good to be with you and to explore concepts of the future. So I am a social worker, but I'm also a very interdisciplinary thinker and actor. And I always get excited to be in community with people from lots of different walks of life and different disciplines. The future is plural. The future is interdisciplinary. And so what I'm going to do is take you through some of the things I've learned the last few years. For really the last 20 years, I've been working around the edges in and out of futures work. And it's been the last few years, in particular, last 3 years especially, that I've really dug in deeply. We've got a university-wide Futures Collaboratory going on where we've had a group of about 25 faculty, students, and staff who've been intentionally exploring futures issues. And I'm also starting up a national futures initiative for social work. So walk with me and we'll walk into what futures thinking is all about. Obviously, right now, what's key on most of our minds is what happens after COVID and trying to imagine a post-COVID world. Imagination turns out to be an extraordinarily important dynamic in futures work. And right now, of course, not only do we have sort of the COVID, but we have huge racial justice issues that have, I shouldn't say emerged, they've been in plain sight for quite a while, but they have emerged uniquely during this COVID time and are increasingly being called sort of a co-feature of pandemic, a dual pandemic sort of issue. We've got to learn together and get ready to co-construct the next world. So part of futures thinking, and I know this series is about resiliency in this time, asks us to consider pretty central questions. How will COVID-19, and I will add in this racial justice dynamic, how will these things change the world? History tells us that pandemics change the world in lots of ways. How is this time going to change the ecosystem we live, we practice in? What kind of world do we want to go back to? That's increasingly becoming a huge debate. What choices do we have? How will COVID-19 change us individually and in communities around the world? How will it expand us, evolve us, strengthen us, test us, etc.? How do we use the moment that we're in to really envision what that evolution might look like? And how do we start imagining and preparing for our collective role in recovery? Um, we know that the need for healing, both physically, emotionally, economically, it will be like nothing we've ever probably experienced in our lifetimes. And what does it mean to get ready? So what I want to do is just talk to you about what futures work is all about. And I love this quote from a futurist that I follow and have learned a lot from, Stuart Candy. The greatest existential challenge facing the human species can in part be traced to the fact that we have underdeveloped practices for imagining possible worlds out loud. So important. Imagination, again, a huge part of our work. Futures thinking connects the past, the present, and the future. So history really matters. Kurt Vonnegut said history is just a bunch of surprises to the people at the time, but as we look back, the past is full of patterns. It's about the present and very much about how do we, in a more disciplined way, look ahead. It's about learning from the past, making sense of the present, and then connecting these to that arc of meaning and choices. It's also about unlearning a lot of our ways of thinking about what is and isn't possible. So at times like this in history, the veil between what's possible and what's impossible is especially porous right now. My work is very critical, postmodern, cultural, interpretive, participatory, very holistic, with a deep bow to an indigenous lens. Actually, indigenous people have been some of the world's great futures thinkers since the beginning of time, and a commitment to future generations as a key part of indigenous thought. So futures work is a newish discipline. It's newer than sociology, for example, but it does have more than a 50-year history. Futures thinking is about managing exponential change. And, traditional strategic planning or traditional strategic thinking sort of is somewhat linear in the way that it progresses. And so human thought and much of our planning practice has followed that. But the truth is change doesn't happen that way. Change tends to happen more exponentially. And nowhere do you know this better than in the tech world, for sure. So futures thinking is how we manage exponential change. It's a philosophy, it's a set of tools and skills, and there are literally thousands of people around the world operating as futurists, practicing as futurists in a variety of traditions in the public sector, private sector, and across, as I mentioned, all disciplines. So what futures work is and isn't, it's not predicting. It's more like map making and navigating. It's not about controlling the future, which isn't possible anyway. The futures folks I hang around with are not about dominating the sector with one voice or one vision. And it's not driven by current economic political frameworks or goals. It's neither progressive nor conservative. Futures work is sometimes criticized for being elitist or sort of white supremacy anchored, or it can be valid. That can be a valid kind of thought, but there are various schools of social work. And again, I ascribe more to ones that are pluralist, disruptive, ones that do constant sustainability analysis and power analysis, iteratively challenging power relations in answer to the question, ultimately, who gets to decide the future? Should it be just a few people, or should we all have a say in what the future looks like? So increasingly futures work and practice is becoming democratized. That's a big push. So the toolkit for futures work includes something we call the P's: discovering and imagining the probable, as well as the preposterous future, taking advantage of and imagining the probable, steering towards the preferable futures. Signals are a big thing in futures work, and this is a practice, not a behavior or an intellectual parlor game. It's about monitoring globally, continuous, iterative, and in community. Signals are what is after or beyond trends. So once something is a trend, it's already happening. Futurists concern themselves with what's happening, what might happen after the trend we're in right now. Futures work is very conscious about official or used futures. Official or used futures are those which powerful entities hand down and say, this is how the future is going to be. Futures tend to be looking more for unofficial futures, the futures around the edges of society, technology, culture, because they give us a lot of information about what might be right around the corner. Scenarios are a big part of the toolkit. They allow us to play out how different combinations of signals might play out. So classic scenario frameworks are things get better, things get worse, things stay the same, or something transformational occurs. And transformation is something that it's defined by being almost beyond our capacity to understand at the moment. So change frameworks operate in using all kinds of other futures tools and games to play with the ideas that come forth from signals and scenario work. And they go deeper into dialogic and imaginative activities to unleash new possibilities, new ways to prepare, and new kinds of agency for getting that work done. So futurists use a lot of thinking tools. This is from Amy Webb, who's a very famous futurist. I highly recommend her tech overview called The Big Nine, which is about the big 9 tech companies. But she talks about the 11 macro sources of disruption, and sort of thinking about your organization in the middle, but technology being sort of a huge driver in modern ecosystems, and then the 10 around the corner, or 10 around the edges of this circle: wealth distribution, education, infrastructure, government, geopolitics, economy, public health right now, demographics, and I think that includes a lot of focus on the equity conversations, the environment, and media. Not only do each of these items in futures thought interact with your organization and with technology in general, but they also interact with each other. So part of what this scenario work includes is really thoughtful, creative intersection. What happens when you converge wealth distribution, infrastructure, government, and public health with technology and with your organization? What scenarios spring forth from those ideas? So futurists give us scaffolding to stretch our creativity, to stretch our thinking, and imagine our place and our path in co-creating the world that we want. A lot of futures thinking is about that agility, mental agility, and that means being able to think several things at the same time. So one of the games we play a lot with people is, where do you stand on this vertical continuum? The world is getting better or the world is getting worse? Where do you stand on that? The truth is there's plenty of examples actually of the world getting better and the world getting worse. So both are true. But on any given day, most of us move along that continuum. Just as I am able to influence the future, the horizontal continuum, I'm able to influence and I'm not able to influence the future. Futures thinking is trying to push us up into that left-hand corner, push people up, help them feel a sense of agency and a sense of positive possibility. While keeping our eyes open to the ways that we don't have as much power as we need and the world is not going in the direction that we want it to go in. There's some fun principles of the future that also help us expand the way we think. And so these are just some basic futures ideas. The future is plural. Many scenarios are possible. It's a combination of alternative futures: possible, plausible, probable, and preferable. It's open, not fixed, and that's a good thing. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. The future is fuzzy, and since we can't know exactly how it'll unfold, our foresight is always going to be imperfect and limited. The future is surprising. It's not always smooth or continuous. Sometimes, as we have seen in recent months, it arrives in unexpected ways. But the future is also not surprising. Sometimes the future is boring. And so those two are very interesting related to COVID, for example, because a lot of people have been saying and studying and predicting that a huge pandemic was going to hit in the near future. So is the pandemic surprising or is it not surprising? And futurists debate that, and as we all are in the world. The future is fast. The future is always accelerating, but the future is also slow. Accelerating change gets all the attention, but the balance of the future is also slow, plodding, and predictable. And that's, so those are some fun principles. Good futurists are actually able to think all of these ways at the same time. And when you bring a futurist into your space, a futurist helps an organization adapt to these many ways of thinking simultaneously. I think the other thing that happens in the futures world and what futures thinking and architecture brings into our organizations is that so often the future feels a little bit like the picture on the left, like we're a little tiny boat and here comes the future. It's this giant wave that's going to crash over us. And there's a lot of times when that does feel true. I mean, I think especially in recent months, we've all wondered what is going to happen next. And there's a lot of jokes and memes about that. I think the plague of locusts is actually here, but what will happen next? So many things stacking up. The truth is, futures thinking urges us to think about new ways to navigate. And so this image on the right is more of a kayak analogy as opposed to a little tiny boat about to get whomped by a wave. Really respecting the idea that traditional levers of how to navigate often don't work in the climate we're in. The tempo and the strategies need to be dictated by the circumstances we live in and those aspects of the future we might see coming. Success is very messy and it depends on collective action. So I love this analogy. I think futurists and futures thinking help people move out of the left-hand image to more of the right-hand image. Power itself is changing and coming more from a hierarchical tradition, which is how we've thought of how power moves, to more of a distributed approach. And the photo on or the image on the left sort of has hierarchy versus networks, but the truth is there's also lots of different kinds of networks. So there's a great book out called The Future of Power. I had it by my desk, but I put it away. A great new book called The Future of Power. I urge you to look at if you're interested more. They urge people to think about power rather than a possession or an acquisition, more as a current. And it's a really interesting and exciting book. So many futurists are studying the future of power itself and how it moves. But other futurists are looking at the future of issues, the future of social change, of work, of organizational life, the future of cities, of technology, of climate, food, communication, identity, human rights, racism and equity, family life, coupling and relationships, well-being, religion, trust, political life and democracy, the future of war and the future of peace, and then not to mention products galore. Again, futurists would also play with all these categories to say, what does the future of social change, the future of work, and the future of family life, how do they all interact and how might they spark each other into some new ways of new dynamics? Futurists also work on the future of professions themselves. So there's whole aspects of futures work happening in the future of medicine, the future of being a doctor, the future of being a nurse, or all health professions, the future of education, teachers, both in K-12 and what we're doing at PSU, looking at the future of higher education and how we shape and co-create that, the future of law, the future of journalism, of architecture, of divinity. And I can't say enough about this particular book, The Future of the Professions, How Tech Will Transform the Work of Human Experts. Excellent, thought-provoking book. Can't say enough about that. Because of the equity challenges we're all facing, I also really want to give a shout out to Ruha Benjamin, who is a professor at Princeton, who's written a new book called Race After Technology. And she is an expert on algorithmic racism, an emergent issue I think is especially important for TAO members to consider and be thoughtful about as you continue your work. She says with emerging technologies, we might assume that racial bias will be more scientifically rooted out. Yet rather than challenging or overcoming the cycles of inequity, technical fixes too often reinforce or even deepen the status quo. She calls this the new Jim Code and the ways in which new technologies not only reproduce inequities, but sometimes deepen them. Racism then can become doubled, magnified and buried under layers of digital, what she calls denial. So excellent book, Race After Technology, can't say enough about it. Ethics is a huge issue in futures work. And if you haven't ever heard of, this is called Ethical OS. all you need to do is Google it. Great ethical set of frameworks that cover things like addiction and dopamine economy, economic inequalities, machine ethics, surveillance state, data control, monetization, implicit trust, user understanding, hateful and criminal actors, truth, disinformation, and propaganda. Ethical OS, check it out. Futurists use this a lot, and to Jane McGonigal's point, she says, this is how we develop systems we end up not regretting the things we have built. Very important. VUCA is a really important concept, the idea of appreciating that we are living in VUCA times increasingly, and this was true a few years ago, it's especially true now. Times that are volatile, times that are uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And futurists specialize in helping people wrap their brains around, and then their methods around an understanding and appreciation of this in the world. Developing leadership in a VUCA world is probably the defining feature of modern organizational and leadership success, that ability to flip from a frightening VUCA to a hopeful VUCA, which includes vision, understanding, clarity, and agility, the ultimate dilemma for leaders in the future. So I would say, to the point of this series, the ultimate source of resilience is appreciating that VUCA exists and that leaders need to adapt and deploy sort of new sorts of resources and skills. Making our minds more elastic is a huge part of Futures work. This is another way of looking at the P's I mentioned before: possible, plausible, projected, probable, preferable futures, and increasingly preposterous futures, and thinking about things that might be impossible or wouldn't ever happen. Again, the idea of what's impossible has really changed in the last few months. I don't have time to go through all of these, but this is sort of an overview of futures language and practice, things like algorithmic racism, design justice, Afrofuturism, digital justice, degrowth, calm tech, global brain, resilience hubs, cyborg anthropology, panopticon, post-capitalism, synthetic humans, democracy 2.0. These are all things that we talk about in futures work and study. Fascinating. In closing, I love Tom Atlee, is a wonderful futurist who says basically things are getting better and better and worse, faster and faster. That's very much the futures world that we live in. And with that, I want to just open it up for some questions and dialogue. We have just a couple minutes left. Let's see, I'm gonna ask for assistance to see if we have any questions.
Yep. So thank you for that, Laura. That was definitely a lot of material packed into a very quick presentation. And I'm sure we could spend like entire sessions unpacking some of those different topics.
Exactly.
One question that I received a little earlier this week from one of our members was, a lot of the writing about the COVID-19 crisis has been about it's an acceleration of existing trends. And you mentioned during your presentation, sometimes there are truly transformative events. And I'm wondering, are you or any of your colleagues seeing anything in this crisis we find ourselves in, or for that matter, in the racial inequity crisis that is now unfolding? Like, do you see things in this moment that could be transformative?
Yes, I mean, there is a lot of discussion about are we in the midst of some transformational events, and most futurists would say that's up to us in some respects. Do we choose to lean into the transformational opportunities? I think what everyone agrees on is the ingredients for transformation are growing, they are gathering, they are there, they are present, but they do require sort of collective lift. And so the question becomes, do we choose to participate? And what happens if we don't? And what does transformation mean? These should be collective democratic processes, not just processes that a few people get to decide. Big tech, for example, and this is Amy Webb's point, the big 9 tech corporations shouldn't be deciding what a transformation in society is about. Those should be democratic processes. And so, my answer would be, I personally believe, yes, big transformations are coming. And I think in some respects, they're already here. But I think it does require us to truly participate and lean in together and have more discussions. And I also think that's why futurists are, as we were just chatting before the session, futures are busy right now, because one of the biggest challenges we have in the futures community is getting people to slow down and overcome this intense short-termism that we all work under so hard and think a little bit longer term. Right now, futurists are busy because everybody has a sense that even the short-term thinking is very complicated, let alone the long-term. How do we navigate these very complicated times? How do we plan for 6 things at the same time for the next 6 months? And so we're busy, and we don't have to talk people into taking futures work seriously. I think everybody gets sort of a new level of thinking that's required. And that new level of thinking is part of the transformation you asked about before. People are asking for my slides, and so there is a link. I'm just putting them in the chat. There's a
good,
link.
perfect.
Being able
Awesome.
to download my slides, yeah.
Yeah, you also referenced a lot of great resources, and I'm sure we'll do some follow up with you and see if we can maybe share a resource document out on some of the topics you covered. You mentioned a little bit about sort of this decentralization and sort of more participatory aspects of what a future state could look like. And so we're seeing a bit of that with some of our member companies where, they're dealing with individual employees and their individual circumstances in ways that maybe they didn't necessarily have to when they were all in the same physical space together, right?
Yeah.
So they're all distributed and at home and in different situations, right? Different environments. And there's a lot of issues there. And I'm wondering, are you seeing a lot of this trend towards sort of distributed or decentralized systems, not just in corporate policy, but more broadly in this crisis?
Yes, because we absolutely have to. And so one of the spaces where things are accelerating is many of these things were already underway in the future of work space. So the people who've been looking at that, and I don't know if it got mentioned, but I'm a research fellow at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto. That's iftf.org. I highly recommend popping in and just browsing around on their website. It has amazing sort of future of work resources, and also some very interesting post-COVID scenario resources that are available for free, and all kinds of publications and resources. But yes, we're seeing a lot of that this is just one of those spaces where the future of work is coming on way, way faster. People that thought, oh yes, we're looking at 1 to 5 year transitions, it's already happened because it had to. It just had to. And now we're getting into more, how do we boost our effectiveness? Because I think most people would agree we're still very much in a transformational space where we're able to sort of do it, but we're kind of hanging on with white knuckles and we're not exactly relaxed into it. We haven't quite figured out across the board what excellence means in that kind of work environment, that kind of work space. So I think that's going to be a lot of the work, is figuring out how do we go to that next level of excellence and opportunity, taking advantage of those opportunities, even down to just the little things. I mean, probably each of us has a whole host of stories about what's been great about working at home and what's also been hard in terms of our own, physical regulation and, oh my gosh, I forgot to take out the trash. And so pulling yourself out of something to go do just the day-to-day, like we're all learning how to balance the way it used to be with the way it is now, with the way it might be in the future. So we're personally doing that, and our systems are learning that.
Well, thank you, Laura. I mean, it's been fantastic. I feel like we just scratched the surface on some stuff, and we definitely will be inviting you back to do some more stuff with our members and our network.
Well, listen, my goal is to just get everybody as excited about futures thinking as I am. I do believe it is a sort of set of oars to navigate complicated times, and it's so much fun. It's so interesting. So I look forward to being in touch with any of your members and with all of you to help in any way I can. Thanks, everybody.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And thank you everyone for attending today. And also a big thank you to Portland State University and AT&T for supporting the series. We have some more programming restarting again in July, coming up next week and the week, or later this week and next week, we'll be doing our Techlandia event series and design sprint. Hope to see many of you there, and we'll reconvene on resiliency in early July. So hope you all have a good rest of your week, and thank you for joining us this morning.